welcome all to Words on Whiskey. And never mind the man behind the curtain. Serge couldn't be with us today in premise because if you did hear him, he's extremely sick at the moment. Has the big COVIDious Rex at the doorstep. So I'll be on a one night only stand interviewing Drew Mayville. This will be a first for me, not just hosting this show, but also letting someone else do the talking. But if I can't think of any better man to listen to doing the talking than Drew. Drew is those of you who drink bourbon already know who Drew is. They've sent a long bio that I'm not going to read because it's just a list of all the wonderful things Drew has done, and it'll make him blush. And then there's no point doing that. Towering figure in American whiskey. The equivalent of Billy Lighton of bourbon. For the kind of imagination out there. Buffalo Trace, tremendous distillery, the most awarded by far. Literally, like, whenever Drew reaches for his keys, and probably awards kind of like tumble out accidentally to get so many.
I don't think so.
Anyway, love to have you on the show.
Thank you.
And we'll start, I suppose, with the usual. How did you get into whiskey? And following that, how did you get into whiskey as an industry?
Actually, I got in the industry quite a long time ago, 1980, as a matter of fact. So probably before most people on this podcast were born. And actually, I wanted to work originally into a lab. And so I went, where I lived was actually in Canada, near Toronto. It was a place called Kitchener-Waterloo. And so there was two places that I was interested in working, and that was in making alcohol, actually. So it was either a distillery or a brewery. And it happened to turn out to be the distillery where I went and applied and got the job. And so I worked in the distillery lab to start my career back in 1980. And I only did that for about a year and a half. It was really learning about the distillation operation and how you make whiskey. And it happened to be Canadian whiskey back in the day. And what happened then is that they were looking for somebody to actually work in the other lab in the distillery, in the quality lab. And that's where I ended up learning how to taste whiskeys and other products. And that's I was kind of forced to go over because I was the youngest one and nobody else wanted to go to the quality area. You wanted to be in the distillery because it was one of the best areas to work in that particular plant. And so by fate, it happened to turn out to be the best move for me because, again, that's where I started to learn about quality, tasting incoming materials, tasting distillates, tasting maturates. And that's where my career began in 1980. And that's how I got into it. It was a little bit by chance, but it was selective that I wanted to be in that type of industry back in the day because there was, in where I grew up and where I lived, there was two places to apply, and I applied to both, and I got into the distillery. And that was the Joseph E. Seagram plant that was established in 1857, which is a pretty famous Canadian distillery.
Yeah, and again, some audience members may already be familiar with Seagram's, the enormous entity it's almost like the Titanic of the history of alcohol. It's this huge entity. You've worked for Diageo, you've worked for Seagram's. Can you tell us about what took you from Seagram's through that course to Buffalo Trace?
Yeah, so when I worked at Seagram, I basically did all the jobs that you can actually think of in operations, from supervision right through, and ultimately I became the master blender for Seagram's in North America. So that was, I would handle all the products from tequila to rum to Canadian whiskey to even bourbon at the time. because Seagram owned Bullet Bourbon and Four Roses Bourbon. And so all that took me into the next pathway. After Seagram was sold, I went with Diageo because Diageo actually purchased the assets from the Canadian distillery, so all the whiskey. And then 2 years after, I got the call to go to Buffalo Trace Distillery in the U.S. And I think part of the reason that I added value to Buffalo Trace is because I think our CEO, Mark Brown, always had the vision that he wanted to do more than just some elementary bourbons. He wanted to really grow that facility into a large global company. And I had the background to help in a lot of different areas, especially in the blending area. So that's where I got involved with Buffalo Trace and became the master blender for Sazerac.
And can you tell us a bit about Sazerac / Buffalo Trace and its corporate culture and what's it like to work there?
Well, it's really a great place to work. And Sazerac is a global company. We own distilleries all over the world, from India to Canada. We own several in Canada. We own the Old Montreal Distillery, the Collingwood Distillery, Paul John Distillery in India. We own a Tennessee distillery. We own several more in the U.S., 1792 Distillery. The Tennessee Distillery doesn't even have a name yet, really, other than Sazerac of Tennessee. And we're making products right now of Tennessee whiskey and other products. And we own a cognac distillery, which is really interesting. Just a beautiful area that we grow organic grapes that we're making different varietals that are approved for making cognac. And even though we haven't used those for products, it's coming about pretty fast. So all that, Sazerac is a global company that's expanding rapidly. From a volume perspective, we're one of the top distilleries in the world now. And when I started 18 years ago, we were way down the list. So we've been expanding dramatically. We buy brands all the time. You may know of one of them. It's called Paddy's, which is an Irish whiskey. And I think it's pretty well known here in Ireland. At least I think so.
Yeah, very, very.
Yeah,
very
and now we're even in. One of the things about Sazerac is that not only are we a global company, but we want to build the company and we want to be recognized and respected in the industry for sure. And even when we buy a brand, we start taking that brand and building upon it. So we've even introduced a new product called Paddy Share, which is building on the existing success, the existing brand, and we want to build it out. Just like we did at Buffalo Trace. We have all these bourbon brands when I started, and we've built on that, and now we have even more brands. And we certainly are aggressive in doing that, and we have a vision to do that long term.
And I suppose Paddy is a good tie-in because, again, a lot of watchers of this program would be familiar with Irish whiskey, but might not be familiar with bourbon so much. And Paddy was, a somewhat neglected brand, but an old heritage brand. Actually meant to give you this, so that's for you eventually. But there's some old 60s Paddies.
Wow.
But it's it has quite a history. But it's funny. I don't know. When I was out your way, I was struck by what Irish whiskey can learn from bourbon, and there is a lot to learn. I think everyone can learn from each other, but one very striking part of that was the just versatility of a distillery like Buffalo Trace. I was fairly floored going through and seeing, for Irish viewers, the closest equivalent out this way would probably be Middleton, where you have a distillery that in-house manipulates base distillate and then ages them separately, and then out of this kind of Rubik's Cube creates a variety of brands. Now, Middleton do it with the 3 different styles of pot still distillation regimen and the 2 column still mashes. But for the most part, it's just separated by cuts. Whereas with Buffalo Trace, it was done, among many other things, at that mash bill level of manipulating You know, that's what always struck me about you guys, that you had the stream of wheated bourbon that went through Weller and up to Pappy, and the stream of core mash that's, you know, Stag and Eagle Rare and so forth. And then, you know, obviously the Barton stream, and then the Sazerac Rye stream, and so forth. And the way that you were able to take this fundamental kind of magma and then superimpose it on all these barrels, you know, and you have char level coming into it and warehouse positioning, and the fact that you don't rotate the barrels, but let the kind of Kentucky heat do its thing, and then pluck from this Borg cube. It struck me that there's a lot for Irish distilling, especially at the moment where we're kind of rediscovering a lot of mash bill heritage in Ireland. The mashes themselves aside, from a practical perspective, you know, a lot of that industrial know-how is missing, of someone in a position like yours, seeing those kind of children grow up and blending within that paradigm. So can you explain what you do as a blender within Buffalo Trace and the materials you have at your disposal?
What I do is there's a blender typically will make sure products are consistent. Typically, that's our charge, is that we want that uniformity and consistency. And so when you have a brand, you want it to taste the same all the time. And that's kind of your primary role. But that's only, to me, that's only the beginning. And more to your point is product development and making new things. And that's where I really get excited, when you can actually use your skills. And, you know, you've stated it very well. Irish whiskey, you mix these different components and blend them. Whereas bourbon is a little different, because you mix all the components up in the fermentation, in the cooking cycle, and then the product becomes the end product. And then you blend them or mix them or mingle them from different areas of the distillery and get your final product. So a lot of ways it's more robust. But, you know, if you look at some Irish whiskey, a lot of the pot stills and stuff become very flavorful, typically like a bourbon, more so. And you know, my background was Canadian whiskey, and the same is with Canadian whiskey, is you have your column stills, and you've got your flavoring stills, and you mix them and blend them after the fact, and that's typically what's done. But that's all changing. We're changing the universe here, is that you're actually making the products really flavorful, like a pot still or a flavoring grain. And with bourbon, it's all that together. So as a blender, my challenge in the future is not just mixing the different locations like you described, but the challenge in the future is to make blends of these different components and have a blended whiskey. But that's still a little further out for me as a blender for bourbon, because blended whiskeys tend to have a negative perception because they're cheap. You know, they've got that perception that it's got, you know, your base whiskeys, and then you have this flavoring whiskey that you blended together. And in the US, blended whiskeys are value brands. So the consumer doesn't understand that you can actually make a fantastic whiskey if you blend it, because the individual components, even though they're great, when you put them together, you can make something more unique and more, I think, a better whiskey. So to me, that's where we're going. And as a matter of fact, I've just blended a pretty good whiskey, I think, with some of the best components that Buffalo Trace makes. And we're going to actually release it under the Last Drop banner, because we're using vintage whiskeys that I put away over the last few years. And so I'm going to give a blended whiskey of not just bourbon, but straight whiskeys. So as a blender, that's where I get excited, in making new products and unique products that will never be made again.
And when you say blended, are you required? So for instance, here, if you had two different mash bills done by a distillery, say two different pot still mash bills, and mix them after the fact, you're not required to call it a blend. You can still just call it Irish pot still whiskey. Would you,
right,
if you mixed, say, like the Sazerac rye stream with the wheated bourbon stream, would you be required to call that a blend?
Well, you would, because they're different. They're not both bourbons. The straight rye is a different, so you'd have to say bourbon and straight rye.
So that's the wrong example. If you took like high rye bourbon and mixed it with the wheated bourbon,
No, you can still call it bourbon.
Okay. And you wouldn't have to call it a blend, or would you be required to call it a blend if it was done in house?
No, it's
Okay.
still a bourbon.
Okay. So yeah, because again here, the term blend, as you say, has gained all these kind of carry-on baggage, largely through our side of the world, and particularly blended Scotch and internal brand positioning that people imagine when they see the word blend. But of course, it can mean very, very different things. Jameson is a blend, but it's made in-house at one distillery. It's just a blend of column distilled and pot stilled product.
Yeah, but that's where it becomes different because it's lighter. The column still tends to be a lighter product. So a lot of people like the flavor profile of a lighter product. Canadian whiskey is much the same as Irish. It's lighter in style, whereas bourbon has the flavoring components all together into one mash, and that's why it's a lot more robust and flavorful. And like I said, yeah, I like Redbreast, for example, would be an example of the flavoring all in one, right?
Yeah, because there you're talking, it's much more of a mash bill. Redbreast is made of a mash bill of 60% malt or 60% raw barley, 40% malt, distilled out, fermented.
Correct. So now you're getting full intensity of flavor. It's rich, robust, and that's where people are going. In my view, that's what bourbon is, and that's where people are going. And I think same will happen with your industry in Ireland.
And I suppose just to walk people through, so I'm holding on brand. I always have one of these at the house.
Oh, yeah.
The Sazerac rye. And I suppose as good a place to start as any. A lot of people know the name Buffalo Trace, but of course Buffalo Trace brand is only one part of the big Buffalo Trace. How would you put it? Nickel and bone shop of different concoctions. But anyway, can you talk about, I suppose, from first principles, going through the grains? What do you think? What goes through your head when you're putting this together? As an example, the Buffalo Trace rye mash. What do you see as the kind of soul of that stream?
Yeah. So what that is a straight rye. So the predominant grain happens to be rye. And so when you actually are making it, you would expect, even when you taste it, for rye to dominate, that spiciness to dominate. So if you made one at Buffalo Trace that was 99% rye, it would really dominate with that spicy, peppery character. But ours, because of the recipe, has a proportion of corn. And what that does is basically it adds that fruity sweetness to it. So when you taste it, it's not going to be all rye spiciness, even though it might predominate. You're going to get a lot of that element from the corn and from that structure of that mash bill. So for Sazerac rye, I target around 6 years for that product to age. So that gives you a nice balance of the spiciness, the fruitiness, and then the wood. Even though it's not predominant, it's nicely balanced. The wood, especially if you had an older one, because we make that same recipe for older versions like the Sazerac 18. And you'll see how it changes that rye structure, the flavor profile, that actually enhances, but at the same time diminishes the pepperiness and adds the complexity of being 18 years, even though it's the same recipe. And the wood is much more predominant because of the age and obviously because of the new barrel.
Yeah, and I mean, my favorite of the whole range is Thomas Handy, which I prefer to the Sazerac 18. And I think it's a bit younger. I like the Sazerac 18, but as you say, it loses a certain amount of that kind of rye bristle when it gets to this point. Whereas what age is Thomas Handy roughly?
Well, that's actually something that's not well known. Is we picked the same age as the bottle you just held up.
There you go. That's why I like it.
So that's one of the best whiskeys in the world by some people, and it's actually only about 6 years old. So that whole myth of being old to be a great whiskey is really a myth.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I love about this one is, as you say, if ever I'm explaining, or it's a great way to explain a mash bill as a concept, because as you say, there's that high maize in it, even though it's a rye whiskey, and it gives it that weird, for me, this is almost like if root beer could become wine. It has that weird like sarsaparilla kind of cola nut thing between spice and sweetness.
It's definitely like a candied sweetness, like candied orange sweetness.
Yeah.
And I think I just envious that I don't have a glass in front of me like you do.
I'm sorry, I would have left. So I actually had it in my rucksack when I was at earlier. But anyway, a great, I think I had a whiskey from you guys. It was one of the E.H. Taylors, and it was a rye with a higher portion of rye. I don't know if you continuously do it or if it was a one-off, but it was a more of a kind of it was just rye and barley in it.
Yeah, well, we do a core set of E.H. Taylor, and then we do some that we release periodically. That's a one-time deal. So you'll get some special ones. One thing you got to remember with the E.H. Taylor is the proof will be at bottled in bond, so it'll be a higher proof too. So what I'm hearing from you is that you tend to like the higher proof products. So if you like Thomas Handy, I could understand why you like a higher proof bottled in bond version.
Yeah,
because it really pops. The flavors really pop.
It's gorgeous. It's like again, Dr. Pepper. If Pepper had become some sort of nuclear device. I suppose starting from there. So rye, we'll just go through the grains themselves. So describe what rye does in your bourbon mashes, as opposed to say straight rye whiskey. When you're changing mash bills and you're going up or down rye, what's the main effect?
Yeah, well, the rye obviously is gives you that pepperiness and that aromatic character. So if you use more rye, it's obviously going to dominate more and throw the balance off a little bit. So you really have to like balance that, like, at least in my perspective. And I think that's why a lot of people like Buffalo Trace, because the balance is really nice. It's not dominating, so it's really sharp. You might like it, but most people wouldn't. So that's what I look for, and when we adjust the proportion of rye, and you can see the difference if you taste a straight rye whiskey, is you throw the balance the other way towards the rye end. Whereas with, say, for instance, at Buffalo Trace, the balance is there between the spiciness and the fruity sweetness, along with that aging, that oak character. So that's what we look for. And we don't, not that we don't have any in experiments, but we don't really take the rye to the next level where you go really high rye. And I think one of the reasons is because it's limited your market with that because of the taste profile.
Right, because I remember you worked for Four Roses, and they do some very, very high rye bourbon.
Yeah,
one of them goes up to 35% or something.
Right, and there's a Canadian whiskey that's almost 100% rye too, and it's not as spicy, but their distillation technique is what makes it less spicy. So there's different ways to play with that.
And I was going to ask, you do push it up when making this product, and I've always found it very strange that, for me, this is sweeter, even though it's over the 51% rye, into the rye category. I find it sweeter than some bourbons that have high rye contents. Yeah. And is there a reason that happens, or is that to do with the distillation regimen, or some sort of mysterious fog hanging around Buffalo Trace?
Yeah, those are top secret things I can't talk about. No, it's I think it's partly due to the heavy portion of corn in there that counteracts, and it actually, as it transmits across, as it goes across your palate, the spiciness subsides and the corn sweetness actually may, because of the difference, the dramatic difference may actually be accentuated. You may see it or perceive it to be that more. Whereas when the rye bourbon, for instance, has less rye, you may see the sweetness up front, but then it it actually changes to that rye spiciness towards the finish. So the balance is affected that way. But I do think it's the contrast, and that shows you that rye peppery spiciness, with then all of a sudden in the middle of your palate, different parts of your palate, the sweetness comes out even more that way. So I think it's more of a perception thing.
And how do you think rye deals with, I think a lot of people here aren't as familiar that rye is regulated in the same way that bourbon is, where you're using virgin oak. What happens between rye and virgin oak as opposed to bourbon and virgin oak as they're growing up?
Well, the best example is what we talked about. When you have Sazerac rye, you really do get a lot of that spiciness, that vibrancy, because it's only about 6 years in a barrel, whereas the 18-year, it actually mutes it, actually mellows it out. And I think you've kind of said that when you've tasted it, is that it's not as vibrant. So it takes away that rye spiciness and moderates it quite a bit. So I think that would be the easiest way to answer your question. It does change at that virgin oak.
Yeah. And it's funny because one thing we hear here that's fairly ridiculous sometimes is, oh, all the differences in spirit will just be washed out by the wood. And
well, I don't agree with that. No,
no, it's patent gibberish. But you guys are a wonderful living example of you can age this stuff to extremities, and Sazerac 18 is not going to taste like Pappy of the same age era. They are fundamentally different.
And what we're doing is we're actually, Finn, you know already, I think, that we're experimenting with extending the aging too. We're not experimenting with younger ages, but we're experimenting with older ages to see if we can change the taste profile over a period of time, which is pretty exciting because it's work that really hasn't been done, and it takes a long time to get some results.
No, absolutely. And I suppose speaking of Pappy is a good segue into the opposite, into wheated bourbon. So again, you guys, some of you probably already know, bourbon just has to be above, well, among the other many laws around bourbon, has to be above 51% corn. But after that, you can kind of play with the mash bill. And wheated bourbons would be those bourbons that don't have rye but have wheat as the adjunct grain. Again, Maker's Mark would be a visible one, but not nearly as notorious as what you guys make. So Pappy, how did the whole kind of Pappy craze start, and where is it now? I think there's few whiskeys out there that have more of a a buzz around them.
That's an amazing story. I think there's a lot of reasons. I think probably the primary, Finn, is the quality of the product. I mean, you have to have a good quality product. And sure enough, that's one of the best qualities you can get. And so back in, I would say around 2006, bourbon started to come back in the United States, even around the world. So people started drinking more of it. The cycle started to come back. And then a few things happened. A lot of the products like Pappy were featured on some shows, and Anthony Bourdain really pushed it, and it got a big plug. And so people started recognizing it and wanting to try it. Then, we had I think the Beverage Tasting Institute rate it like 99 or 100. I forget what it was. And recently, I think they rated Redbreast 27, really, I think, perfect in 100. So it doesn't happen too often that you get that kind of accolade, and that really spurs interest in people trying it. But with the craze, or the growth of bourbon, plus it was at the right place at the right time, and also it's limited quantities, so it makes it hard to get. And so you get these ratings and you get these placements on big movies and TV shows, and you get these ratings, and then you got a great quality product. I think all those things all together made it really something that you have to go get. And now it becomes a challenge to even find a bottle. And I think people, if it's hard to get, they want it more. And I don't think we'll be making 1 million cases of Pappy, but you just never know.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think there was a story a while back of the Pope being given a bottle by a priest from Kentucky, and the American whiskey writer Lou Bryson put up something I remember on Facebook. It says every day I get messages in the mail saying, "How do I get Pappy? Get made Pope and they'll send you one. Now stop asking."
Well, it's no, even at Seagram, Crown Royal was given to the Queen. So at the time, so there's always stories like that going around.
Yeah. And I suppose what many people might not know is Pappy, of course, is really that wheated stream that you guys do. And you have Weller, which is readily available in that same mash, but not the same whiskey, but that same trajectory of Weller up to William LaRue Weller and the kind of Weller in the collection.
Yeah, so that's a really important, wheat being much softer grain, it really accentuates some of the flavors, the sweeter, fruitier flavors. And that I think is really important in differentiating it from the rye bourbon, the wheated bourbon being much more palatable and easy to drink for some people. So some people like that, Finn, and some people don't. And there's quite a difference in taste profile between the two. But Weller is the same recipe as Pappy, but we haven't been running Pappy forever. It used to be made at Stitzel Weller, which most people know.
Of course.
But obviously, that plant doesn't make it for them. We make it now at Buffalo Trace since 2002.
And between them, so yeah, if you're talking, would there be a difference in the way you would put together at the higher end William LaRue Weller versus a Pappy, or are they just the wheated stream at different age points with different selections, different labels?
Yeah, there is a difference because the antique collection, the William LaRue Weller, even though it's the same recipe, I have total freedom how to pick the barrels from anywhere in the distillery. So it's actually a blended product. And I pick the areas that I think will make a great product every year. So each year will be vintage. It'll be slightly different. It's never intended to be exactly the same. And so since it's uncut, unfiltered, it definitely gives you a different taste profile because all those fatty acids and esters are still in there. You haven't filtered them away. And also the higher proof will really make the flavors pop. Whereas the Pappy is filtered, but it's also blended. And Pappy is selected by Julian or Preston and myself and the tasting panel. So we kind of pick and set aside some of the best for those products there and certain locations throughout the plant. And then we select them individually. So we'll have 100 samples of a certain product, like of a 12-year-old on the table, and we will reject barrels and not use it for Pappy. It's only the best of the best.
And I suppose now that we've gotten a little deeper, you guys obviously have quite vaulting rick houses. It's much hotter. Well, Ireland is not really high up on the heat map. You're here at a lucky time, but for the most part, a damp, cold, miserable, land of winter. Obviously heat rises as well, and you guys don't rotate barrels. Can you describe the difference roughly between, like, if you're looking at a barrel at the bottom and say a barrel of the same age that's in a different part of the warehouse? What kinds of variations would you see barrel to barrel within even the same mash bill?
It's actually dramatic. We'll actually pick certain products. When you have an open warehouse like that, the top will be 10, 20 degrees warmer than the bottom. The bottom will be, if it's 100 degrees outside, it could be, 60 degrees or less in the warehouse. So what that means is when it's cooler, it's not going to age as fast. It's going to age gracefully. Whereas the top, it's going to age much faster because you're forcing all that liquid into the barrel and extracting all the components. So we actually have certain brands that would get off the top. So our younger brands would be near the top of those warehouses. and a Pappy Van Winkle 23 would be at the bottom, because if you actually have a Pappy 23 on the top where it's hot, in 23 years there won't be anything in the barrel.
Of course, yeah.
So
we have
really there's quite different in the taste profile between the top and the bottom of those warehouses.
And I thought I was asking specialized questions, but we have one popping up here. Will you do any special releases from the High Rye Mash Bill 2 branch? Elmer T. Lee in Buffalo Trace Antique Collection, ? Smiley face.
Well, we usually don't talk about what we're going to do, but you just never know with Buffalo Trace. How's that for a real definitive answer?
Keep them guessing, keep them on their toes.
Well, to be honest with you, that's exactly, we want to excite our customers. We don't want to meet expectations. We want to make sure they're looking forward to our products and looking forward to what we're doing next. So every day we're always trying to excite our customers. And I think we do a good job, but we have to even do better in the future.
And I suppose, an example of that, most people, myself included, would think of wheated bourbon as a distinct thing and say high rye bourbon is a distinct thing. But I had a whiskey from you today that had both wheat and rye in it, the 4-grain bourbon. Can you talk about what it was like to throw those two contradictory maybe grains into the same mash?
Yeah, a 4-grain is probably one of the best whiskeys that you'll ever taste, at least in my opinion. And what you taste with a normal wheated and a normal rye bourbon are two different things, but these are all those grains together. So you taste the combination of all of them. And that's what I get. You get that soft silkiness up front from the wheat. You get the spiciness, the fruitiness, and then the balance with the wood, because it's aged 12 years, is absolutely fabulous. And unfortunately, that was an experiment, the 4-grain. So there's none left. So if it's in a bottle, that's the only place that you can get it.
Got it.
And one thing I want to point out on the wheat is we don't put the wheat at the same proof as we put rye bourbon in a barrel. The wheat is lower proof. So that allows it to age a little longer and a little more gracefully too.
And do you put all your mashes at different proof, or is it just wheat needs to be treated a little differently?
Wheat needs to be treated differently, and we've even done experiments with lower proofs, because everybody believes the lower the proof, the better it will taste. So we've tried higher, we've tried lower, we've tried just about everything.
And are they all distilled to roughly the same proof, or is this just when you're
correct?
Cracking?
Yeah, but when you have the alcohol higher, you're going to extract different components. It's going to throw the balance differently. So,
of course.
So very important aspect of bourbon is the proof that goes in the barrel. But by law, for bourbon, it cannot be higher than 125 proof.
Right. And people forget over here, regardless of what kind of still is used, you guys are capped at 8% for distillation purity. So there's actually quite a few pot distilleries in Ireland that go slightly over 80% when they're doing a triple distillation. So
yeah, but that would be a good experiment for them.
Yeah.
Because it's like Canadian whiskey too, is you can distill it much higher, but you're getting a different taste profile based on that. So there's so much you can experiment with.
Yeah, I mean, some people, of course, that most of the blending column still whiskey in Ireland is made of maize with a little bit of malt, but it's distilled to like 93%. So it's nothing close to the profile of a bourbon, because so much of it's being bled off in the first place.
Right, all the congeners are gone. Right, it's almost like a vodka.
And again, the last kind of question I would have would be, when you're doing, say, the 4-grain, what would you find the difference between, say, the mash bill, the flavors you would get from these grains by creating a mash bill versus the flavors you would get by blending them after the fact from already made?
Oh, that's a good question, because that's what I'm doing. Well, that's really good question, and it's going to be different is the answer, but will it be better? That's what I'm trying to answer, because you can do exactly what you're describing. Like Canadian whiskey is a good example, is that it's all blended after the fact. So you put all these different components and then you blend it, much like Irish. So what happens if you put them all together? Will it be the same? Will it be different? Will it be better? Will it be worse? That's what we're trying to figure out. So those are good questions. I have my own opinion, but we shall see.
Well, a good scientist holds their opinion until they get the answers back.
Yeah. It'll take a while, unfortunately, because we need to age it.
And I mean, I remember seeing you guys have done even non-traditional bourbon grains. If I recall, you did.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
The,
And some of them I don't like, but it's just the way it works. Experiments don't always work out.
well, the good thing is, even if you didn't like it, people will buy it because it's a curiosity, and
Right.
they're delighted to dislike it. It's the whiskey drinking or drinker, I think, is very kind of geeky by nature in comparison to other spirits.
Yeah, it's surprising. Sometimes we do have little bottles, our experimental collection, and even though, like, personally I don't like them, people like to see what happens if you did this. They're just curious, like you say.
So can you pick one grain that you've kind of tried out, whether for better or for worse, and tell me what the experience was like? One non-traditional grain that you've thrown into bourbon.
Well, we've done several, but it's more not just one, but it would be a combination of several grains. So like sorghum and a few others. And I wasn't too keen on, I think it was a 6 grain, and rice. So anything with carbohydrates like that, but not a fan of them. But it really is interesting because you see how it looks with different components, as I said. But nothing stands out to me other than the 4 grain. I think it was 10 grains, and I wouldn't drink it.
And I don't think, has anyone ever made wheated rye, or would that just be a contradiction in terms? Majority rye and something other than
if you can think of it, Finn, we've done it. I just might not tell you.
Fair enough.
No, if you have any ideas, you can just pass them on. But they go on our list. We have a big, long list. Harlan, our distiller, has a list of many more experiments that we haven't even tried, but we want to.
And I remember you guys have quite a free-spirited kind of corporate culture. It seemed like a lot of people were given permission to kind of bounce ideas off of each other. Can you describe what it's like working with your team, with Harlan, with everyone who doesn't maybe get a look in or is as visible, or what it's like working on the site?
We certainly do. We believe in making better whiskey. So our mandate is not just to make the great products we make, but also to make better whiskey. So if we learn something from one of our experiments, you can make better whiskey. That's what we're all about. So our innovation is probably unparalleled in the industry. And I would suspect a lot of people are working on innovation because we've been so successful with it in the industry. We have meetings twice a year. And so it started out pretty small. When I first started, we had some small meetings with a few people where we brainstormed ideas. And we would end up putting these whiskeys away, and some of them turned out pretty good, like the 4 grain, as you saw. That was one of those ideas that was experimental. So it's growing now because we have all these other distilleries, and every 6 months we get together and all the distilleries hear what others are doing, and it feeds off each other. So that culture is starting to become ingrained in our company. And not only that, the collaboration now between facilities and trying to make better products and different products is unbelievable. It's just feeding off each other. And I think it's almost out of control. There's so many ideas and products that we're actually making. But, I think the key is the success of this program is it's 100% endorsed by the CEO of the company. It's a way of working every day. And I think that's the key right there. It's not only encouraged, but it's more than encouraged. We can spend money and we can actually do it. And I think part of it is we're privately owned, so we can do this. We don't have all these shareholders looking for profits. We can spend money and do this experimentation because I think we've been very successful at it.
There's another particular question coming up. Did the single oak project give any surprising results?
I would say a better understanding. I wouldn't say surprising. And so what we actually did is that we picked the best as far as our customers are concerned on the single oak project. We had a tally of all the votes, and we are actually making that for a product. It'll be called the single oak whiskey. So I wouldn't say it was surprising, but I would say it's a lot of learnings there. And, you know, we've had some of the world's foremost experts come in, and we could, you know, show them exactly if you hold these variables consistent, and this one is, you can vary it, you can see the difference the whiskey will make. So there were some very interesting things, probably, in my opinion, more expected, but you could actually see it in the whiskey.
And I suppose, obviously, bourbon is required to use charred virgin oak. But if I'm correct, it doesn't have to be American oak. That's not the legislation, correct? That you can use charred virgin, some other varietal of oak.
Yes, we do that. Good question. We actually have a product. It's called Charter Oak. So it's Old Charter. It's a brand that we have. We call it Charter Oak. And we've got probably around 6 or 7 different oaks from around the world now. And we've released it, and they're all different. And so I've even had calls from around the world from different distilleries asking about the program because they're very interested in different species of oak and what difference it makes on the taste of different products. So that's just another variable that we can explore. And, you know, we've got even project now with different states having different oaks, and we'll see how that turns out. So again, you can go down that rabbit hole. There's another plethora of information and learnings and different taste profiles. And everybody knows about French oak, how different that is. But we also have done Canadian oak, Hungarian oak, Chinquapin. I mean, all kinds of different oaks in experiments.
No, absolutely. It's something we're seeing here to a certain degree. There's, I think I might have mentioned Irish oak. It's a bit confusing here because actually Irish oak is a type of oak. It's sessile oak. But the term Irish oak is often used here to refer to trees that happen to be growing in Ireland. And so sometimes the distinction can be, you know, what do you mean by Irish? But definitely there is that space, and the results are staggering and strange.
Right.
Even within the same oak, you already had char levels as a way of, you know, even without changing species, getting radically different. Can you explain for those who wouldn't be familiar the levels of char and what that'll do to a bourbon?
Yeah, we typically use a number 4 char, which is 55-second burn. And that will give you a different taste profile because we've done experiments with different char levels and in other words, different times of burn. And it gives you what we have now is like an alligator type texture to it. And so that'll give you a lot of those oak flavors. So if you cut back on that, less burn, you're going to have less oak influence and more of the internal chemicals from the oak coming through. And you don't have that filtration as much with that charred because it's less. So there's varying tastes based on how it's charred. And some, in cognac, it's really not charred. It's actually toasted, like it just burnt. So there's different flavors there. So there's just whatever you can think of. There's so many variables and experiments that you can do with all these different char levels. And I mean, that's just one variable. If you bring in 2 variables like that, it's even more combinations and permutations.
No, of course, yeah. Take 2 different types of oak. Are you
Oh yeah.
charring? That was
Right.
one thing that struck me was how fast it happened. I remember going to Cooperage for I think it was Independent Staves
Yeah, it
and
was
learning
very
how alligator char isn't even a minute long. That it
right.
happens 15-second intervals radically change the profile.
Yeah, Finn, we did an experiment, and we do, like I said, lots of them. And one we actually did an infrared technology where we change the chemistry of the surface of the barrel inside. And so, with short wavelengths and long wavelengths, and we actually measured that and we put it in barrels, and it turned out to be pretty good whiskey. So there's lots of different ways of looking at it.
And I suppose, yeah, into the Star Trekky stuff from there. You do a lot of odd
No,
innovation that's kind of cutting into new spaces. You do temperature controls in one warehouse, I believe.
right. It's in our experimental warehouse.
And so explain, if you might, the logic behind that, as opposed to just the natural rick house left to
Yeah.
respond to its environment.
Did you want me to talk about the one going to the moon? No.
Sure.
No, I'm just kidding. No, we were thinking of Mars. No, I'm just kidding. So our warehouse X, we can basically control all the aging parameters, because our belief is, or at least our theory is, what happens if there's a better way to age whiskey? If you can control it and get a better whiskey, why not try and discover what that is? So what we have is this little mini warehouse. It has 4 chambers, actually 5 with a breezeway, and we can actually control all the variables from airflow to light to temperature. And we're trying to study what happens and what would be the optimum for making a great whiskey. Maybe the answer is that we make the greatest right now. I don't know. But we're trying to learn from that. And the first experiment that we did was light. And the reason we did that is because we had an incident at Buffalo Trace where we had a small tornado come through and actually damage one of our warehouses, warehouse C, such that the wall fell down and the roof came off part of it, and we had to fix it. But it took 5 months. But that whiskey turned out to be really good. So was that because of the light? So that was our first experiment in this mini warehouse to test to see if that was it. So we took 2 years, and we had our control and our light somewhere in the dark, somewhere in the light. So we had it arranged in a design of an experiment, and we found out after 2 years that light didn't make a difference, which is kind of funny, but that was our first experiment. So we're on well beyond that. We actually call that product E.H. Taylor Tornado Surviving Bourbon, and it actually turned out to be a great bourbon. If you do look at that product online, you can see it still being sold on the secondary market for quite a bit of money. But it turned out to be a pretty great bourbon. A lot of the bartenders thought it was great.
No, I remember some of the notoriety around. Well, you could always sell the other stuff. You could call it Buffalo Trace Light, and carve out a new market. You could even spell it like Lite, like Coors Light. But
well, that's where you make the big money. If you had less calories, that would be great.
And any other experiments that you want to touch on before we move on?
No, I can't talk about all those top secret experiments.
Fair enough. I suppose extrapolating from yourselves into just your role in American whiskey, how has American whiskey changed over the past, let's say over the space of your career?
How it's changed?
Yeah,
it's
as an industry.
Well, in the space of my career, especially the last 20 years, it's really changed dramatically, because bourbon has revolutionized in the last 20 years in the United States anyways. I don't think it's gone that far all over globally, but in the US, it's very popular right now. So I think we're really seeing a premiumization that never existed. So back in 1983, we had the first single barrel bourbon called Blanton's. And that was way ahead of its time because it wasn't selling back in those days. Now you cannot find it on the shelf. So you've seen that premiumization. The trend is more about the quality and the premiumization, not the value brands. And I think that's what's exciting the customer. And also, we got a new generation of whiskey drinkers. I think we lost them for a few years with the whole trend with vodka, and now they're coming back in droves, and they're looking for that adventure. They're looking for that learning. Even when we did some sessions this last week around here, is the people that are coming are quite young, and they're really interested in learning about whiskey and how it's made, not just to taste it. I mean, that's part of the whole experience, but they do want to learn about how it's made. And I'm really excited. We're getting a higher level and caliber of people coming in and asking some great questions as compared to 10 years ago. Before, it used to be just a taste. Now it's about, well, how do you make that? Why is it different? I think we're attracting a new breed of drinkers, a younger breed, and I think a lot of people who are typically drinking value brands are trading up too. So there's a couple things going on there, and I think they really want an alternative to the mass whiskeys. They want that premiumization. So I almost equate it to the beer market, because in the U.S. the micro distilleries have done very well. They're looking for that exploration. They're looking for that excitement, discovery, and they want new tastes. They want bolder taste. They want something different. So I think there's a movement there that's coming over to the bourbon side, looking at that. So it's coming back. So there's a lot of new things happening. There's a lot of trends happening that really is helping our sales in bourbon across all our competitors.
And I suppose, again, the craft distilling landscape is a
right
subject to bring up because, obviously it's, although by mass, Kentucky still makes overwhelmingly, 95% of bourbon is made in Kentucky still?
Yeah.
But, in terms of distillery headcount that popped everywhere from, I doubt there's a state in America that doesn't have,
right.
county in America at this point.
Right.
But, how do you see Buffalo? You're in a position where you're one of the larger distillers, but have this reputation for tremendous innovation, more so than some of the small ones, even. But how do you think? Where do you see the industry going now that you have so many more people making whiskey in the U.S. and, as you say, I think in line with the kind of move in the early 2000s towards people just being more inquisitive about what they're drinking and eating in general. The consumer has become more curious about stuff that before wouldn't have really occurred to them. Where do you see yourselves going in that environment in the next, 15 years?
Our objective is to continually make better whiskeys and to excite our customer. We want to thrill them. We want them to want to buy. We want fans of our products. So we keep trying to innovate and do exactly what we're describing. We want to experiment. We want to make better whiskeys. And I think the micro distilleries also can do that. And I think that will be good for our business overall. The problem with the micro distilleries is that they can't wait the time that we can wait. And that's a big disadvantage for them. So they need to put product out that's 2 years old, and they need to charge a lot because they'll lose a lot of money to sit and wait for that to age 10, 12 years like us. So I really see the innovation piece being the future of the business and the premiumization and giving people what not only they expect, but what they don't expect. And that's the challenge. That's hard to define. But I think we're pretty good at trying to get there. And the journey's a long journey, so it's going to take us a while. But I suspect that people who keep persisting and trying, they're going to get there. And Buffalo Trace and Sazerac is probably one of those companies. And I'm not just talking about bourbon or whiskey, I'm talking about rum, I'm talking about tequila, all the product categories we're involved with. It's pretty exciting, including cognac. So that's what's exciting to me as a blender, is that we get to dabble in all those categories, because the next big trend could be something like a rum, Irish whiskey, Canadian whiskey, all those things, right?
And on the subject of aging, and some of the small distillers might be on the back foot, there was a question there.
Okay.
Given your mention of the use of light, what is your opinion on artificial aging experiments?
When you say artificial, are we talking?
Accelerated aging, I assume, is what Frank is talking about.
Yeah. Well, we investigate those, believe it or not. We actually don't do much of it ourselves, but I get the request to be investigating some of those claims. And I would say 99.9% of the time, we find that we're just getting more oak character, as opposed to development, flavor development, and all that. So it's really hasn't been successful, and we're not saying it's never going to happen. I think part of what people drink whiskey for is because of the mystery that we see, the whole interaction with the barrel and the aging process. But we still are not putting our heads in the sand. We're still investigating those things. And if we have any experiments, we will look at them. But that's not where our focus is. But we still are investigating those things.
Open-minded to it.
Yes.
And I suppose on the subject of what's the next big drinks category, it's odd for us seeing the kind of bourbon boom, because Ireland is getting this kind of something similar but late. You know, it's a quickly growing category now, but bourbon went through this, you know, and it's always strange for us. I mean, you've seen Irish tax prices. You know, when I see bourbon enthusiasts online complaining, infuriated that they have to pay, I don't know, $40 American for a bottle, and you see what we're charged. And it's I remember when this was, you know, when you could get a bottle of whiskey for less than $1, you know, when gas and bourbon were whatever price, and seeing that premiumization occur, or, you know, of course, when whiskeys become scarce and they just end up on the secondary market for absurd prices. How would you say, aside from the growth of distilleries and say like customer enthusiasm, how would you say, I mean, just raw bourbon consumption, when did that start taking off? Or
yeah, I think it was about 2006 where the numbers kept growing, including even brands like Pappy, is it started really growing. And now it's to the point now where we had to invest now over $1 billion at doubling our capacity. So we're building, doubling our capacity. So we're building 12 new 100,000 gallon fermenters. We're building a new warehouse every 4 or 5 months of 60,000 barrels. And we're doubling our still. So we're adding another still. So it's exponentially increasing for Buffalo Trace. And I know all the distilleries in Kentucky are actually expanding. So one thing's going to happen. Either we're all going to be very successful, or we're going to have a lot of bourbon on the market in the future if it goes down. But the good news is Buffalo Trace and Sazerac is really not global yet. We haven't touched the market globally as other competitors have. And so we have a lot of opportunity for us globally versus just the US, because in the US, it's very difficult to find our products now. So we haven't saturated the market, but we by far have a lot of room for expansion overseas. So we have a lot of opportunity, upside opportunity globally as a company. But since 2006, approximately, you start seeing the numbers go up and up for bourbon. So I think that is going to continue. Hopefully it continues forever, but as we've seen in the past, it's been quite cyclic.
Of course.
But we are prepared for that. We have other opportunities in other product categories because we touch everything.
Right. I mean, I suppose the only thing that could go wrong would be, a redeclaration of prohibition, but short of that, you're
Well, we'll make medicinal whiskey then.
get in on that early.
Yes.
Well, I suppose that kind of brings us to the end. Unfortunately, that question is off the table, Dan, for the moment. So maybe we'll have Drew on sometime down the line. But of course, you are, looking in all kinds of categories. And it's great to see. I suppose that the last, talking, does the average, I suppose to summarize, does the average consumer know when they see a bottle of Buffalo Trace, do they even cop that it's the same? So like, for instance, Jameson and Redbreast are made in the same place, but the average Jameson consumer has no knowledge of Middleton or anything beyond just the labeling of Jameson. Do you find something similar with Buffalo Trace flagship product, that it's growing that as its own kind of obstacle or not obstacle, but kind of process as opposed to the making of whiskey?
Well, I think that's where we're different from a lot of companies. Is we have a great tasting and a great quality product, and there's good reasons for that. We could go through them. But at the same time, even when we do training sessions, we want consumers to learn about our products and to understand what they are and what the differences are. So I think some of our consumers are very well educated on how our products are made. And we have a lot of social media things we have on the internet, how we make our products. So people are very into that. I think that's the next generation of young drinkers. They want to understand everything about our products, and we share that information with them. So I think we tend to have consumers and people buying our products that really understand who we are and what we want to do.
Yeah, and I suppose transparency, is another thing.
To a point.
Yeah, to a point. But how would you put it? Consumer engagement,
right.
People want to have some sort of attachment they want to geek out over knowing that, there's a weeded stream and there's such. And it's not just the casual tourist asking questions. People can be quite, train spotting about the whole thing. I'm guilty of it myself. And if I remember, your tours are all free, correct?
Yes. We want to build brands, Finn. We don't want to make money off a tour. We want to build brands for the long term. It's not a short-term proposition with us. So when they come, we want people to enjoy the experience, and they're all free. So you have a tasting, you have everything. But one of the few in Kentucky that are free. And so you can come in anytime and take 9 different tours, but you have to sign up ahead of time. And you can learn everything from plants and flowers in the distillery to how bourbon is made at our distillery, and then have a tasting at the end, and it's all free of charge.
Yeah, it's a staggering sight. Obviously, we didn't touch on Pompeii, the distillery beneath the distillery ruins. Right. Quite a visceral link with the past. But I suppose to sum it all up, when you bring people on those tours, what, if you were to describe the soul of Buffalo Trace, the ethos, what are you trying to communicate to them? How do you want them to feel about your brand or brands or distillery?
We want them to have an experience when they come to the distillery that they'll never forget. We want it to be emotional. And I think we're really moving down that pathway. We have people writing letters and how they're sharing drinks. And I'm sure it happens with a lot of other distilleries. And it's really become emotional proposition when they have a drink with a friend and have I just hear it all the time, and I see more and more of it. So we want people to have an experience and enjoy our products with their family and friends.
Great. Well, that's probably the best point to end on. So thank you very much, Drew, for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoy your time in Ireland. I think I'll see you tomorrow. Later in the week. But honestly, come again anytime. There's about God knows how many people on this sidebar here who would be checking your flight times. You'll be getting letters, stalker letters, if you're not careful. You know, dear Drew, why don't you write back? Yeah, but
Well,
grand.
thank you very much, and sorry about Serge. I hope he's feeling better.
Yeah, same here. So hang in there, Serge. I assume you're huddled up watching this in the dark. I'm no substitute, but I'll stand in.
Okay. Thanks.
All right.
Thank you, Finn.